Education often comes at the end of the day, so this isn't a surprise to us who work in education, but as we've been hearing throughout the day, it's also at the heart of everything. I think education came up in almost every single session in one way or another. And it's often expected to be the solution and answer to everything, but I'm afraid we're not going to give you all the answers here. For those of you who work in education, we've got some colleagues here. We often find the problems and are not so good at finding the solutions, so hopefully we'll be able to collectively try and do that together. I'm going to give my presenters, panelists here, very brief introductions. We were joking about this earlier, so I want to make sure there's enough time for them to speak rather than me doing all the speaking. So we first of all will be hearing from Professor Yusuf Said, who has held a number of senior positions both in South Africa and in the UK, and is currently the Professor of Global Education Policy and Equity in the Faculty of Education. And I think it's very fitting that we are also ending today with two speakers who are Cambridge Africa scholars, and I think they're at the heart of the future of education research and research more generally. So we're very pleased to have both Kenny and Nwagbo and Priscilla Bretuo, who are going to be talking to us about their research for their PhDs. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from them. So I'm going to hand over to Yusuf.
Recording in progress.
Going to hand over to Yusuf first. I'm glad none of that was recorded. So we'll already start the recording now. To Yusuf, who will give us some of the bigger picture, and then we'll hear from Kenny and Priscilla.
Okay, thank you. So it's been a fascinating conversation so far, and I think I'm going to start by referring to the UN General Assembly's midterm assessment of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's been referred in different ways throughout the conversation today, but for those who are not familiar, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals set up in 2015. It's arguably the most ambitious development agenda and the most critically reflective development agenda. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of Africa in particular and education specifically. But let me start with the report, and I think it's appropriate to have a quote. The report, somewhere in its report, says, "It is time to sound the alarm. At the midpoint on our way to 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals are in deep trouble. An assessment around 440 targets for which trend data is available shows that about half of these are moderately or severely off track, and over 30% have either seen no movement or regress below the 2015 baseline. This includes education, it includes hunger. The world is back at hunger levels not seen since 2005, and food prices are higher in more countries than in the period. And conflict is more endemic than before, and climate change is proceeding faster, and we're currently at most of the tipping points of measures. So what does this look like in terms of Africa and education? First, let me just make a few remarks about education and climate resilience and change. What we know is that education is heavily climate impacted in Africa, right? Yet, paradoxically, it is also the key for building adaptive capacity. So its potential and its peril are simultaneous. Climate-related disruptions to the education system has shown that about 25 out of 33 countries are places where children show extremely high vulnerability to climate shocks, and those are all in Africa. The Malala Fund estimates that climate disruption will put an abrupt end to schooling for at least 12.5 million girls every year. And this is likely to impair the educational attainment of mostly the marginalized. In conflict terms, in Africa, at least one minimum of 1.91 million children and nearly 44,000 teachers in Western Central Africa have been out of school or closed due to conflict. And that conflict is not just in Africa, it's also globally. And in Sudan today, education has virtually ground to a halt in most parts, and more teachers than not are being killed. In 2022, the number of forcibly displaced people reached 36 million on the African continent, a threefold increase over the last 10 years. The majority are children and young people. If those trends persist, more young children and young people will be out of education or in need of support in conflict-affected settings. Forced displacement acutely impacts access to education and the continuation learning. So I won't go through in great detail, but the more further negative side is that in terms of teachers, the latest global estimate of number of teachers we need are about 44 million more in primary and secondary, and the greatest number are in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa will need 15 million additional teachers to reach any of the sustainable development goals by 2030. And this is in a context in which the number of qualified teachers in sub-Saharan Africa is 69% compared to a global average of 85%, and in which teacher attrition is twice as high in sub-Saharan Africa, quite high relative to others. And this attrition persists in terms of gender, where more women are underrepresented in leadership, facing discrimination and unsafe working conditions. So that's the context, and it's not a very positive. In the 2 minutes I got, I'm now going to say something about how the policy response has been. The policy response has been, in a sense, a recognition of this context and a recognition of the intersection. The high-level panel on teachers recently produced its report, and the International Task Team for Teachers for Education Teachers have also published a report, and they've argued very positively for we need to rethink teaching, we need to rethink the production of teachers, and we require what is called a new social compact for education. A compact for education which is about teachers as key to the determinants of learning after we discount home background, but teachers also as working in a wider cross-sectoral policy, joined-up policy environment in which equity is a key consideration in teacher professional development, teacher well-being, and teacher governance, including development. Simultaneously, the African Union and its continental education strategy for Africa has recognized the crucial role of teachers. And I think this conference and symposium is appropriate title because the African Union has declared the theme of 2024 as the year of education and the year of teachers. And it's appropriate to talk about its commitment as one of its key objectives for up until 2063, to revitalize the teaching profession, to ensure quality, relevance, and I would add equity, and to ensure that they sets up a coalition of all educational stakeholders to facilitate and support initiatives arising from the implementation of the Continental Education Strategy for Education. So working together is a key priority of CISA and the African Union. Yet, the problem is twofold. The problem of that is financing. We haven't spoken about financing and the costs. So let me give you a few ideas of what the costs like. Just on the teacher target, if sub-Saharan Africa wants to get the number of teachers to provide equitable and quality education as the SDG promises, we need $39 billion. If we extrapolate that globally, we need $120 billion, an estimated annual cost for universal education targets. Yet we know in the last 30 seconds that teachers are key. And teachers are key too because what happens, everything, all the debates, what happens about the environment, what happens about climate, what happens about deforestation, what happens about inclusive economic growth, what happens about gender equity, all starts in the classroom with teachers, and therefore paying attention to teachers and their working conditions and developing equitable joined-up strategies there. I've cut a lot of details, so in the question time you can come back on the evidence and details, but I focus and flag the high-level messages. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Kende.
Thank you, Yusuf, for that wonderful start and for handing over to me. So my name is Kene. I am a third-year PhD candidate at the Faculty of Education, and my research looks at the political economy of quality-oriented education reforms with a focus on public-private partnerships in education. The focus of my very brief 7-minute talk here today would be to examine this growing trend of PPPs in my country, Nigeria, with a focus on exploring the rationale behind the adoption of such policies to deliver basic education, which is the first 6 to 9 years of schooling, depending on context. I will be locating this discussion on PPPs within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and partially within the African Union's 2063 vision, briefly outlined by Yusuf. So first things first, what is the biggest challenge facing the field of education and international development? If you ask experts some 24 years ago, they would have said it was the high number of out-of-school children. And so this was a priority in the year 2000, with the introduction of the UN's Millennium Development Goals, which urged governments around the world to provide universal access to basic education for all. 15 years after that, as Yusuf mentioned, a new set of goals were introduced called the Sustainable Development Goals. But this also marked a paradigm shift in education from its focus on just getting children into school to now ensuring that those children are actually learning while in schools. See, it wasn't obvious at the time, but we now know that the years of schooling is not synonymous with learning. And studies released, towards the end of the Millennium Development Goals 15-year deadline showed that less than half of children, and that's a very generous estimate, were not meeting their minimum proficiency levels in reading and numeracy in many low-income, middle-income countries around the world. So the introduction of the SDGs in 2015 marked a global shift in education by now calling on policymakers to also remember or to focus on upholding the quality of this education for all. This declaration also aligned with the African Union's Agenda 2016, which was released about 2 years earlier in 2013, and hoped to achieve a continent of well-educated citizens by 2063. Now, almost a decade later, since the release of the SDGs, and it has become increasingly clear that whilst it was relatively easy to enroll children into tuition-free public schools, ensuring that these children acquire foundational learning skills is not. This is reflected by recent statistics, which shows that over 300 million children worldwide are unable to attain their minimum proficiency skills in reading and mathematics, despite their long-term enrollment in schools. Further estimates also show that Africa is lagging behind, with only 29% of African learners meeting their targets, compared to 57% of those in other developing countries. So how can African policymakers bridge this access learning divide? Specifically, how do we ensure that education systems are fit for purpose by providing children with the minimum competencies required in reading, numeracy, and critical thinking? If you're waiting for the answer, we don't have it, as Pauline mentioned earlier. But recently, governments have identified the problem to be a capacity issue. For example, with my research participants who were teachers, civil servants, political elites, they all said the same 5 words to me. Government cannot do it all alone. Yeah. More importantly, governments have also recognized that it is a problem that requires widespread systematic reform. And so my research in Nigeria spotlights a wave of quality-oriented reforms gradually expanding across 5 states in the country. These subtle set of systematic reforms are unique in the sense that they are being delivered by state governments in partnership with a single for-profit private provider, an arrangement more commonly known as a public-private partnership, or PPPs. PPPs are a source of contention in the field of education and international development because there is much ideological debate surrounding the role of private participation in public education, as well as the extent to which their actions can be regulated under the guise of partnerships. However, despite the heated ideological debates within the literature, little is known about the views towards private sector participation from African policymakers, teachers, and other government officials who are actually engaged in these partnerships. To address this gap and many other gaps, as is expected of a 100,000-word thesis, my research situates the study of PPPs within the politics of education literature, which holds that stakeholder dynamics, that is the combination of stakeholders' interests, ideas, and institutions, determines the success or failure of education policies. Applying a political economy lens to the study of PPPs means that my research can help us understand why policymakers in Nigeria have been successful in gaining support for private sector partnerships amongst teachers, local government officials, and education civil servants, whilst this has not been the case elsewhere. And if there is one major takeaway from my research, it would be that the successful introduction of PPPs rests on three things. One, political commitment towards quality education reforms by the ruling elite. Two, the ability to restructure the education domain financially, institutionally, and ideologically. And three, a thorough understanding of the legacies of past policies on teachers and other key members of the education domain. In a nutshell, because rounding up, there are several ways the government can partner with the private sector in education to deliver quality education goals. And these partnerships have produced mixed results around the world, which is why they are, contentious. However, I believe, or I've found, I'm seeming to find, that designing a successful partnership model must involve paying attention to the primary interests of the most influential actors in the education domain, which ultimately tends to be teachers, as well as the extent to which the introduction of new private actors supports or contradicts their interests. This will ultimately determine the role that these private actors can play and whether these partnerships will help achieve the country's or the state's education goals. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenny. A nice link on teachers there. Over to you, Priscilla.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny and Professor Yusuf. I think they've done a fantastic job in setting the background for my presentation. So, yeah, those are some of the perks of being the last speaker, and I'm very happy about that. So, my presentation, which essentially focuses on my PhD research, is on the role of non-formal education in achieving the SDGs. In as much as teachers are very important and pivotal to ensuring equity and quality in education, and in as much as public-private partnerships are also important in that regard. The structure of the educational system is also very important. As most of us are here, we went through formal education, a very structured, rigid, regimented form of education where you have to be in school at a specific time, and you close at a specific time with punishments in between for those of us who come from African countries. But research shows that, and even the plight of many students, as has been highlighted by Professor Yusuf and Kenny, shows that this form of educational system is not working for all categories or subgroups of learners. And that typically, those subgroups of learners for whom this form of education does not work for is learners from disadvantaged, marginalized, vulnerable backgrounds, particularly girls. So in this regard, the learning crisis they spoke about, where a lot of learners are now enrolled in school thanks to the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, but are not learning. Most of the students who are actually experiencing this learning crisis, according to research, are those from disadvantaged, marginalized backgrounds who experience structural barriers to learning, like poverty, economic barriers, social-cultural norms. So all these things have been inhibitors to their learning progress in the classroom. So in that regard, governments, educationists, even donor partners are trying to find ways and means to establish ways for these learners to be able to make progress in learning. And non-formal educational systems have been shown to actually improve learning outcomes for children or learners of this caliber. So not only improving learning outcomes, but there are some of these non-formal education programs as well, which have been successful in integrating some of these learners back into formal education. Now, these are considered non-formal alternatives to basic education or to formal education. They are structured differently from formal education, but they are meant to equip these learners with the basic competencies they need to be able to progress in life. So there's a lot of effort in that regard to establish some of these non-formal education systems because they've been proven to improve learning outcomes. Now, with regards to these non-formal education systems, one thing that my research has highlighted is that using alternative or transformative approaches to learning has proven to be very, very important in improving learning outcomes for these caliber of students. So when I talk about transformative educational approaches, this talks about linking classroom learning to community action and change. So instead of isolating classroom learning in the curriculum from what happens in their communities and the structural barriers to their learning progress, these things are integrated into the learning process for these learners and not isolated. So in that particular regard, addressing these structural barriers to learning actually demand that community members are involved in the learning process that happens in the classroom. So in this regard, community members in terms of normal community members, but also traditional leaders, religious leaders, and even local experts in the communities that I did my research in, where these measures are put in place and community members are brought into the classroom and some of these structural barriers are addressed in the form of learning in the classroom, there have been more positive impact in terms of helping learners improve upon their learning. And it's not only increased enrollments, but actually the learning outcomes have also improved in terms of helping community members understand the importance of education for these learners, and also helping to not only challenge the structural barriers, particularly in terms of sociocultural norms that act as barriers, but also other issues related to poverty, and also getting community members to support the learning of these particular caliber of learners. So in that particular regard, my research shows that it is very important for governments and educationists to not only focus on getting children into school, but also to focus on developing systems that integrate the specific learning needs of children, particularly those from poor, disadvantaged, vulnerable backgrounds, into education to enable them develop the basic life competencies they need if the SDGs are to be achieved. Because most of these students are enrolled, but as my colleagues highlighted, being enrolled is not the end all be all. Most of them, after being enrolled, are not learning anything at all. So they are not much better off than those who have never been to school at all, as the estimates show. So the highlight of my research is that when community members are involved in the teaching and learning process, teaching and learning is linked to community action and change. The teaching content in the classroom is also linked to what happens in the community of these learners. The learning is relevant not only to the learners, but it's also of value to the learners and can bring about some form of change in the learners, but also change in their communities to address the structural barriers to their learning progress. Another important thing also is that this form of educational approach through non-formal education systems also creates the opportunity to use indigenous knowledge and teaching methods and ways of knowing in the classroom, which is one of the most important things we've been highlighting in most of our research about decolonization of education and all that. So this helps to ensure that at least steps are being taken in that direction, rather than having a very standardized form of education, which does not necessarily meet the learning needs of all category of learners. So it helps to bring all these things into the classroom, which makes learning even more relevant and of even bigger value to not only learners, but also their communities. So my study shows that in communities where there are more meaningful, where there's more meaningful community participation of this nature in the teaching and learning process, there was more community support for the learning of such children and better academic and transformative learning outcomes for learners. So the crux of my research from what I have so far actually shows that focusing on non-formal education and transformative teaching and learning approaches within non-formal education, which link community action and change, which link learning to community action and change, could actually be helpful in increasing enrollment and also improving learning outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged learners, including girls. Thank you.
So I did warn you we would have lots of problems, but I think we have also identified some solutions, so thank you. It's a great challenge to summarize a whole PhD in 7 minutes, but I think you did a wonderful job of that. But I'm sure there's some questions that colleagues have, so I can see if there's more than one at the same time, we'll take more than one, but we'll start here. can see a question here. And Caroline. Okay, and then we'll take Caroline. Are you happy to take 3 at a time? Yeah. So we'll take, and then Caroline and Pauline. Yeah.
So thank you for the presentations. So my question goes to Kene. So I just want to know who the stakeholders, when you are talking about the partnership, who are the stakeholders in the private sector, and what do you expect them to bring to the table?
We're all smiling because when we were discussing earlier, I said there's some words that are banned. One is stakeholders, the other is complexity, and the other is interrelated. So I've had some buzzwords, so that's an excellent question. Thank you.
So I did a good job on the public side. I broke it down, but I didn't.
We'll come to it in a moment. We'll see the other questions.
Right. Thanks very much. So lots of challenges. What about the opportunities then? Thinking about what's the role of technology in improving educational outcomes?
Great question. And Pauline over here. Just need a microphone. Up there. I think because of the Zoom, you probably need the microphone. Maybe pass it along to, if you pass it to the gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you. My question goes to Kenny and also Priscilla. I'm just thinking about the community involvement for Priscilla's work, but also the public aspect of the PPP. Are there any parental involvement in terms of the research that you've done, and if so, to what extent? Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we'll start with you, Kenny, and then Priscilla, and then you can answer the technology question, but also Yusuf for the technology question.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just address the first question, which was the stakeholders in the private sector and the expectations of them. So I mentioned very briefly there's several models of public-private partnerships, and we find that some of them are more contentious than others. When we want to classify public-private partnerships, we look at it as who is funding and who is providing them. Very, basic. So, for example, the private sector can fund, the public sector, continues operations as usual, or the public sector can fund and the private schools will deliver the education. These are a very simple, presentation of public-private partnerships. Naturally, some public-private partnerships are less contentious than others. For example, if the private sector comes in and says they want to give us money, there's going to be it's going to be how much. But if you come and say, oh, we want the private sector to take over our schools, you're going to find protests. And this is, if you search in the news, Google public-private partnerships, you would see protests against that. So when you say the stakeholders, going back to that, we have, the private sector is not a monolith, of course. So we have for-profits, we have NGOs, we even have, to an extent, community partnerships. And again, you find most of the contentions would be with the for-private sector, because when you're trying to solve a goal such as the SDG 4, it raises the question that should we be profiting over providing education to those who need it the most? So you find that these partnerships are contentious. If they are bringing in the money, that's great, that's corporate social responsibility. But if we are giving them the money to operate the schools, even if it's in the best interest of the children, because we believe it's a systematic problem and the private sector is more efficient, that would still create pushback, because what you're doing is you're threatening the interests of the head teachers, of the public sector administrators of that school. So it might be a fantastic technical solution, but when you apply the political economy lens, whose interest is being, defunded here? And where is that pushback? Is it going to be sustainable? And the answer is no. So I hope that addresses your question. Going to Pauline's question about parents' involvement, yes. So part of the partnerships I've been looking at is systematic reform, and it includes the whole spectrum of stakeholders. I personally did not target parents because I was looking at decision makers, but what I found in my research was this new reform also included community level partnerships in the form of SBMCs, which stand for school-based management committees for those not in the education field. And what I found was these school-based management committees tend to replace the PTAs, parent-teachers associations, in the sense that the government was saying, these schools, government cannot do it all alone. These schools also belong to you. So what you find is the SBMC comprised of parents, local influential people in the community, youth as well. And what they did is they had oversight responsibilities. They could walk into a school and see if the teacher is there in class. They can walk in and contribute money as well. So they were also at the beyond the public-private partnerships, there was also community-level partnerships, which some might argue are a form of public-private partnerships because parents are private actors. So that did occur as well, but that was something that I stumbled upon. I didn't go on into the field to find.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, so I also did not directly interact with parents, and I think I omitted to say my research was in Ghana. I did not directly interact with parents, but from the reports I got from some of my interviewees, particularly the facilitators, parents were supposed to be involved in the community engagement process. So the community members who were supposed to visit the classrooms to learn on pivotal themes that were of relevance to the community, like themes on disability, themes on gender-based violence, themes on sexual and reproductive health, gender. So parents are supposed to be involved in these and also make contributions and then voice their opinions. But in most of the communities I visited, according to the facilitators, parents were not interested in the program or learning about these things, except one community. And I think the incentive for that one community from the data analyzed and the patterns I observed was that the traditional leader, who is the principal leadership figure in that community, was very vested in the educational program. And interestingly, he was a religious leader. He established a community school for the community. He built a hospital for the community. So they had a high level of reverence for him. And he endorsed the program, was actively involved, which encouraged parents to actually also get involved. So according to the facilitator, parents would visit the classroom, would want to find out from her what the girls are learning, and would continually thank her for teaching the girls. So in this community where the girls actually needed some things to create artifacts for their learning, parents were very willing and happy to provide that. So in that community, I think parent engagement was more positive, but I think the catalyst for that was the example modeled by the principal leadership figure of that community. But I didn't engage with parents directly because I didn't have scope for that.
Thanks, Priscilla.
Thanks, okay. If I can just make, the research evidence tells us three things about parental involvement in public-private partnership. One is the state must have effective regulatory mechanisms and accountability structure for any involvement of the private sector in education and for parental involvement. Because without that, it's a question of who takes the risk and who takes the responsibility. Second, you need to capacitate parents and school governing bodies to more equitably get involved. Otherwise, it becomes quite tokenistic and meaningless. Third, it can only occur in conditions where there's a high degree of equity and social justice within the education system. And often parental participation in public-private partnership tends to privilege, and the evidence tells us, certain groups of parents and certain groups of schools. The issue of technology is an important one, and let me start with first the negative and then the positivities. But you know, we did a survey of technology in sub-Saharan Africa, just a face survey, and there are 5 things we found out, which I think it's an initial exploratory study, and this is quite important. First, it offers a very, as EdTech social enterprise companies offer a narrow and restricted range of content, limited to a narrow range of subjects, specific maths, languages, and it simply automates a lot of the learning. 2, most EdTech social enterprise companies in Africa are proprietary software and license restricted sharing. This tells you where you're going with in terms of what to do. Third, most EdTech social enterprise operate in 4 countries in Africa in particular. Not surprising, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Uganda. The bulk of other parts of Africa are limited or not covered and don't mention conflict context. Lastly, they all majority, 197 out of 203 make their offerings in English, with only limited provision in any African language, and where it's offered in African languages, it's typically Swahili. So this makes an obvious solution to the problem, which is that it's not a problem we need to capacitate teachers, and they need to be active in developing the software. We need to have a commitment to developing a common education knowledge and open public platform ownership, particularly for software and technology companies and learning programs, and we need to empower governments to take a more active role in regulating private sectors so as private sector technology investment so that it doesn't end up reducing inequities. Lastly, it only makes sense in education if it's part of a wider set of reforms, because offering software without offering easy access data, particularly in remote and rural, doesn't help. So it's got to be a joined-up policy program.
Thank you. So we've got time for another round of questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, and great discussion and great ideas going through. Yusuf, I wanted to pick your mind on the mid-term review, or the SDG mid-term review, but also the tool that was used to collect this information. Do you think this tool is representative enough on a global scale? Do you think there are some spillovers or there are some variables that we could be off track, but do you think there are some variables that this tool could be missing, yet are valuable in tracking the progress we are making in education? The other aspect, which I also wanted to pick in the mind from all of you, the experts, is that I'm doing some work with the graduates, fresh graduates from universities, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa. And there is an issue of critical thinking, the shortage of curiosity, shortage of digging in for more information or researching. Could it be an issue in education systems, and how could we address that? And this could go to Priscilla, I think. What's your comment on the role of coaching or career mentorship in terms of helping us achieve more education milestones among graduates who are coming out of these education systems?
Thank you very much. Any final questions?
Hello. Since we are talking about education, I was wondering, what is the role of indigenous African languages in all this? Because over the years, I've been thinking, if you take the average child in Ghana, by the time they are age 2, they can speak their language. So you don't need to really put them in a classroom to teach them head, nose, what are the names. But what happens in a place like Ghana is that we are put in class, and at the same time we are being taught English. We are expected to consume knowledge in that same English. So you are constantly struggling, you don't understand what is being taught, and then at the end of the day, it looks like your brain couldn't do it, you are not good enough. But the main problem is language, because if they change the same thing and tell you in your language, you do not struggle at all to get it. So I'm wondering, where is the place of our indigenous languages in achieving the outcomes we want?
Thank you, a very important question. So I think you've got a couple of minutes each for a final set of comments and any final remarks. So we'll go Priscilla, Kene, and Yusuf this time. So.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Just to address your question on coaching and career mentorship, I think it plays a pivotal role in getting students to the point where they can have practical knowledge of industry. But I don't think it's the be all and end all. Primarily because most coaching programs tend to be quite standardized and, they are standardized and do not have like a specific framework to fit the context in where these students actually need to be learning, to ensure that what they are learning actually fits the economic situations of their country, from what I've realized. So I think what is most important in this regard is that if there should be coaching and mentorship programs, it should be specific to the context where the students are and specific to addressing the specific economic problems that are facing that country. That will make them employable, and that will also make them that will drive them towards entrepreneurship, especially in African countries, which is something that we need. Entrepreneurship that will attend to issues related in the non-formal sector. So I think that is what career mentorship and then coaching should do in that particular regard. Now, with regards to the issue of indigenous languages, With the program that I did my research on, they were actually using local languages to teach the children. And some of them actually use local languages together with English, and after transitioning them into formal education, they continue with English, some local language before they continue all together with English. Now, you know, in Ghana, because I'll speak specifically to Ghana, in Ghana, I think the first 3 years of primary education, learners are supposed to learn in their local language, and then afterwards they continue with English. I think that is a wrong way of doing things. Every cognitive theory of learning and bilingualism shows that that is not enough time for children to be able to transfer knowledge from their local language into English to be able to understand everything that is taught in the classroom, which you rightfully highlighted. So I think there's a fundamental policy problem that needs to be addressed. But as to how it will be addressed and when it will be addressed is a problem, because Ghana's language of instruction policy has been in a flux from the time of Nkrumah up until now. It's not necessarily been stable. The one that we are implementing now is kind of stable, but that is what is not working for most of the students, particularly those in public schools or in rural areas who have never had any contact with English language until they get to school. So there's a fundamental problem there, which definitely has to be addressed. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla. And Kenny?
Yeah, I think I'll just address two things on the EdTech and the indigenous languages. So EdTech was an interesting concept because, just to add to your fact sheet, was that in one of the reports I worked on, most of the EdTech interventions we reviewed were actually done through public-private partnerships. And there's an issue of, the intentions behind that. In the next 50 years or so, a lot of things are going to be digitalized. So it's a new market to capture of sub-Saharan Africa since there's so much space. So even in CSR interventions, when you come in and you donate technology that is licensed, what happens at the expiration of that license? It's a new market for you to capture because the system is now, dependent on that technological software. Also raises questions on, are you designing the best suitable intervention for this society, or is it just the cheapest one that the government's, maybe there'll be a new goal later on that says EdTech by, everyone has access, to EdTech by a certain goal. So these are also things I wanted to raise that were quite interesting. The private sector is spearheading that move. Indigenous languages is very interesting, and it raises, makes me put on my political hat as well, because there is a policy in Nigeria in 2013 which said, children must be taught in the language of their mother tongue in their early grade years before they transition into English. That raises a lot of questions in a country of over 200 languages, right? The language, what language becomes the dominant language of schools? Why should I have to speak in the language of someone, that's the dominant and, drop my identity? Because I might be speaking something differently at home, but the language of the environment is this dominant non-English language. That's one concern. The second concern was, and this is just speaking to why it is not implemented, even though the law is the policy is in place. The second thing is we have to realize that education is a confluence of public and private interests. Yes, it is a public good, a social good, but also we go into schools for different reasons. And one reason for parents is for their children to escape poverty. And escaping poverty is synonymous with learning the English language. This is another reason why they might send children to schools just so they can pick up the language. So that has implications for the overall learning factors, whether children are actually picking it up. But if you find that policy in public schools, then parents from slightly higher income households, even though they're all technically poor, might pull out and go to low fee paying schools just so they can learn English. And that means that, the peer effects that you might gain in public schools goes down because all the, high achieving students, in quotations, will be going to private schools, which further weakens the education system. So the policies are there. Research does show that it does work, teaching children in their mother tongue, but for several public and private interests, that is not being implemented. So again, it speaks to the political economy surrounding these reforms. So,
thank you, Kenny.
Thanks. Okay. I'll tackle the three questions on first the measures of the SDGs. I think the starting point is to recognize the famous public policy maxim that what gets measured gets done. But the problem with what gets measured and what gets done is whether what gets done is valuable in the first place, and whether you're measuring what you're not meant to achieve, and whether the measure is appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. And in that sense, a lot of the SDG indicators that we have are good, but some of them are in education let alone other fields, are poorly constructed. For example, Target 4.1 on learning does not measure learning around critical thinking, effective thinking, environmental education. Target 4.7, which is around sustainable development and citizenship, doesn't actually measure that. What is measured that is the presence of it in policy, but not in the school level. The target on teachers, which Pauline and I wrote about, is about the quantity of teachers, not the quality of teachers and their teaching. So in that sense, problematic as it may be, it's a step forward. But the next generation of SDGs, as we're gearing up to it, has to develop more specific, more meaningful indicators to get closer in education, but generally what we want to achieve. I think that answers some of the question. The issue of decolonization is at two levels. One is it's about language, and there are countries in Africa that are beginning to realize that the bilingual additive model of 3 years of home language and the transition into English is not enough. That far better is to get home, if you like, home language or community language as more integrated into the education system. So South Africa is experimenting with a model that's up until the end of grade 9. Every child will have language of instruction in the medium of instruction alongside English. So it's that kind of model. The risk of that is twofold. The risk is whether the teacher education system is prepared to do that, and whether you have the curriculum and resource networks for that to occur effectively in teaching. So the implementation challenge is that. The second part of decolonization is not about language of instruction, is about what kinds of knowledge you center in your curriculum at the school level and the higher education. In other words, whose knowledge counts and whose identities are affirmed. And that requires a widespread conversation in society about whose knowledge counts. So it's about recovering lost knowledges that have been marginalized or ignored, recovering orality as a key understanding of curriculum reconstruction and education, recovering the subjugated identities of the marginalized in societies. And that's a long-term process, and it's something that needs to check. The third quick question was on higher education, which is an interesting one. How do we track learners from schooling into higher education? Or I think that's part of the question you asked. But I think the other way to see it is to ask ourselves, what is it that schools can produce and what is it that higher education produces? But crucially, what is required for the rapidly changing world of work? A world of work in which skills are not prepackaged or programmed in the same way. Artificial intelligence, for example, challenges the idea that pre-programmed, packaged bodies of knowledge is enough. There's a degree of flexibility and criticality that's required across the higher education. So the evidence we have is when you interview employers, they're less specific about what they require from graduates than what universities think that employers want. It's that alignment we need to get right a bit. And I think I'll stop there, and hopefully I've answered the question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, this session on education was likely to cut across almost everything that we discussed throughout the day, and I think you lived up to that and beyond. So thank you so much for really stimulating discussion and to all the excellent questions and comments as well. So thank you to our panelists.
Oh, you want to introduce me? Okay.
I think everyone knows you.
I can introduce me. Go ahead.
Just thank you so much to everybody throughout the day. I've really enjoyed it, found it fascinating and stimulating. But I think this last part of the day is also really important in the announcement of the Amit Bhasin Prize and also some summing up remarks from our Vice Chancellor. As I said, doesn't need any introduction, but Professor Deborah Prentice, is the University of Cambridge's 347th Vice Chancellor. My goodness, that's a lot, isn't it? And started on the 1st of July, 2023. An eminent psychologist, Professor Prentice has carried out her academic and administrative career at Princeton University, which she first joined in 1988, and has had a variety of roles there, including serving 6 years as provost. And I think actually looking at your experience on various things, including in relation to gender social norms, which is an area that many of us in education are also look at very closely, I think really important for us as a university as well. So thank you so much for joining us and for announcing the prize and your final remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm Debbie, Debbie Prentice, the Vice Chancellor. And as Vice Chancellor, one of the things I talk about a lot is collaboration and partnership. I talk about it all the time. We all recognize how important these things are at Cambridge and everywhere, why they matter. But when it comes to giving examples of international collaboration and partnership, finding specific cases that are successful and enduring is not always straightforward. In fact, it's quite rare. So it was actually a joy for me to learn about the Cambridge Africa program, which I did in anticipation of being here today, and the important work that it does. It's quite unique in the Cambridge research ecosystem. First, it really does have longevity. It's been around since 2008, which is a really long time, especially these days. And the fact that it's still going strong is a clear sign of its success. For an initiative to be successful in any academic environment, it needs academic champions, and Cambridge Africa's enduring success is clear proof of the engagement and commitment of those academic colleagues who've been flying the flag for the program. But the Cambridge Africa program is also a success because it's truly cross-disciplinary. I know that it has origins in the biological sciences, but today it reaches across disciplines as much as it reaches across continents. I understand that the Cambridge Africa program coordinates and funds projects with collaborators in over 35 countries in Africa, involving academics in the university's 6 schools, across all 6 of them. The program has also attracted key funding partners, including the BBSRC, which has supported today's events, and philanthropic foundations such as the Alberata Research Fund. To all of our partners, we are incredibly grateful. Reflecting on the program's success, it's worth noting some of the underlying principles that have informed its mission from the start. The program is based on equity, transparency, and trust. Africa and Cambridge-based partners set the aims for projects together, and they benefit equally from the work. This is truly what collaboration and partnership should be all about. I know you've had a busy time, a long day, lots of talks, lots of questions, and about things from healthy futures, cultural heritage, conservation, and climate resilience, and about the role of education in reaching the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. I wish I could have been here with you. It would have been much more fun than the day I've had, I have to say. To all the speakers, many of whom have traveled from quite far away, we're most grateful for you coming here. And I'm equally grateful to the hardworking Cambridge Africa team, who, under the direction of Professor Caroline Trotter and Program Manager Karina Alberg, have put this event together. So thank you, and a round of applause for them for doing it. Okay, so those are my remarks. Now, I've been asked to present the Amit Bhasin Prize. The prize is named after Dr. Amit Bhasin, who joined Cambridge Africa as program manager in 2019 and quickly became an essential part of the program, much loved and widely respected across the university. After his untimely death in 2020, Amit's friends and colleagues raised funds to create this prize, and the prize is awarded to an outstanding African research student at the University of Cambridge. So outstanding is defined widely to encompass aspects as diverse as academic excellence, the translation of research for the benefit of African populations, excellence in public engagement, participation in not-for-profit activities, general good citizenship, and contributions to student life in Cambridge. The prize winner is expected to show evidence of their outstanding contribution in all these areas, so the bar is set very high indeed. So I think members of Amit's family are with us today, somewhere in the audience, I think, and I hope they will be incredibly proud of Amit's legacy. So I'm told that there were many excellent nominations and that the winner had been especially commended for their excellent research and their efforts to translate research findings into impact. And so, without further ado, it gives me huge pleasure to announce that the winner of this year's Amit Bhasin Prize is Stephen Ajadi. So here's Stephen.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I apologize. I can't be there at the moment. I'm basically shuttling between so many West African countries. I'm deeply grateful and honored to be considered for this kind of commendation, particularly because it's based off of someone who is extremely important to Cambridge, Africa. I mean, I didn't have the opportunity to meet Amit Bhasin personally, but I have heard a lot of things about him, especially in 2019, and there's so many things I heard about him, which is really, really nice. It was really, really sad to hear about what happened, but I'm extremely happy that his name has been immortalized in this form of commendation every year, and I'm really, really grateful to be chosen for something like this. Working in Africa and trying to develop Africa is almost an exercise of despair because there's so many things to do. But I keep telling people that it doesn't matter how little you can do. Everybody should try and do something. And if everybody does the little that we can do, it stacks up over time and space, and the impact can cumulatively be huge. So we shouldn't actually despair at the problems that we find. We should try as much as possible to help out. And that is the kind of mantra that I live by, and that is the motive that drove my PhD research at Cambridge, especially in the research of conflict and violence. My research focused on reducing vulnerability in terms of conflict and violence, and that has been a very, very challenging journey. And it took me through paths of architecture, it took me through paths of real estate finance, it took me through paths of politics, of policy development, and it's still a path I'm on. And luckily, we've been able to do a lot of change in different areas across our health, and we're continuing to work towards that. So I'm really happy that our efforts is actually being recognized. I'm particularly happier that the legacy of Amit Bhasin is going forward. Sorry for the sound, it's really raining here, but I'm happy that this is happening, and I'm also happy that it will continue to happen. So, special thanks to the Vice Chancellor for being here. We've met 2 times, but I don't think you can remember. But special thanks to the entire Cambridge, Africa, and especially to the family of Amit Bhasin. Thank you very much. And this goes out to everybody that is trying to make a difference in Africa to achieve development that is sustainable. Thank you very much.
So I'm just going to give you a little bit of facts about Stephen. For those of you who don't know him, Stephen's a doctoral researcher at the Department of Land Economy here and a member of Fitzwilliam College, having studied architecture at Ladoke Akintola University of Technology in Nigeria. And Stephen's research in northern Nigeria on how spaces can be designed to promote safety in conflict has won awards and led to practical changes. He founded the Penumbra Foundation and the Cambridge Initiative for African Urbanism, which raised funding for practical infrastructure to address the effects of conflict. Stephen was also awarded the Vice Chancellor's Awards for Research Impact and Engagement in 2023, so he's clearly on a roll. And so you've just heard from him from Nigeria, and fortunately, actually a friend of his, Dr. Osarenko Agbeida, I hope that I got that more or less right, is here to pick up his award for him. So. Thank you. Thank you. And that's that. So congratulations to Stephen, and many, many thanks to all of you.
So it's my pleasure to now close the day with a number of thank yous for making this such exciting and memorable Cambridge Africa Day. So I would like to thank our speakers, and in particular those who've travelled a long way and given up their very busy schedules to share their exciting work with us. I'm sure on behalf of everyone here that it's been a real privilege to hear about the work that you've been doing and about your exciting research and your drive to strengthen research and enable researchers to flourish in Africa and translate that into improvements in people's lives. Thank you also to our speakers from Cambridge for sharing what you're doing in Cambridge and also about your collaborations with African colleagues. We've covered a wide range of topics and there's been excellent presentations and wonderful discussion and questions and answers following those presentations. So thank you to all. Thank you very much to our Vice-Chancellor, Debbie Prentice, for summing up today and awarding the Dr. Amit Bhasin Prize to a very worthy prize winner. We did have very many impressive, outstanding African scholars who applied, and it was very difficult to select one person. So I think there could have been a number of very worthy prize winners, but congratulations to Stephen. Thank you to the audiovisual team here who've put up with me panicking at times as whether everything's in place and have very smoothly run today, and for looking after us so well, and the rest of the staff at Downing College who've kept us well fed. And I would particularly like to thank Parinaz Hariri, because behind the scenes, Parinaz has done a lot of the work on the registering people, and it's taken up quite a lot of her time, in addition to the work that she does on the Albarada research funding that has featured in so many of the sessions today. So thank you very much, Parinaz, and it really has, your work with the team is really helping to develop these collaborations between Cambridge and African researchers. And we look forward to a call that will be opening in the next week for the next Albarada Research Fund call. So we do hope that there will be many applications. We had a record number of applications last year, and it would be really nice if we get a very wide range of applications and large number, but very much covering all the different types of topics that we've covered today. So, which is a real strength of Cambridge, is the range of research going on here, and so the range of collaborations that can be established with African partners. And thank you to the Albarada Trust for their generous funding that enables this work to take place. This is also an opportunity for me to thank the members of the Cambridge Africa Strategic Advisory Group for their support and guidance to the Cambridge Africa programme. 4 of its members were particularly involved today: James Wood, who chairs the group, as well as having chaired the first session of today. Devon Curtis chaired the second session, and Pauline Rose chaired the final session. And thank you also to Bhaskar, who for his chairing role as well. And Anil Madhavapedi is another member of our advisory group who participated in the programme today, so thank you to all. Finally, I'd like to thank the BBSRC International Institutional Award, which provided the funding for today. And as well as celebrating all this wonderful collaborative research taking place between Cambridge and African researchers, part of today is to encourage networking. There's been plenty of networking that I've seen during the breaks, but we also have a networking opportunity straight after I finish talking of a sort of a wine and soft drinks reception, and actually 2 of the MasterCard Foundation students, Lillian will be singing, and on keyboards, Ozioma in the background while we do our networking and continue to have the discussions that have been a highlight of today. So thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Corinna.
for the wonderful day, the driving force.
Thank you.